Okay, so we'll be having our test over the American Revolution on Thursday. This video is just to help you review for that test. At the beginning of the war, remember, not everyone was in favor of independence. Only about 40% of American colonists were actually in favor of independence from Britain. Another 20% were actually in favor of staying loyal to England. They did not want to separate and form their own country. And there's a large group of people that were considered moderates or who were in the middle, who weren't quite sure which way they wanted to go. They were unhappy with England, but not sure that they wanted to separate and form their own country. The Patriots and Loyalists all had their reasons for whichever side they fell on. Now, the Patriots' most compelling reason was, of course, that England had been violating their rights over a period of time. And because of that, they believed it was their duty to separate and form a government that would protect their rights. The Loyalists had their own arguments for independence. And one of the most compelling reasons that they had was that they believed while the government of England was not perfect, it still was a pretty good government. And there was no guarantee that a government formed in the colonies would be any better. In fact, they worried that it would be much worse, that the country would descend into anarchy. And so for that reason, many of them thought, well, let's stay with England and continue to work with their government to see if we can bring about positive change. A man named Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense in 1776. And this pamphlet became very popular within the colonies. About 500,000 copies sold within 6 months. Pretty much everybody within the colonies read this pamphlet. And in it, he presented many logical arguments for independence. And what he did is he persuaded many people over to that side of, again, wanting to be independent from England and forming their own country. Some of those who were really influenced by Thomas Paine's pamphlet were leaders within the colonies and were members of the Continental Congress. The Continental Congress consisted of delegates that were sent from each of the colonies, and they had met in Philadelphia, and they had been meeting before, trying to figure out what to do with England. And up until this point, they had been fighting for the rights of the colonists. But after reading Common Sense, many of them became convinced that independence was the best course of action. And so they give Thomas Jefferson the task of writing the Declaration of Independence. And on July 4th of 1776, the members of the Continental Congress vote unanimously to adopt this declaration. And here is where everything changed. The fight from here on out is no longer a fight for rights. It is a fight for independence from England and the right to form their own country. There were 4 parts to the Declaration of Independence. This was a very well-written, well-organized paper. There was an introduction called the preamble, and in it, they just state the purpose. The colonies are declaring their independence, and here are the reasons why. The second section is the most famous. It's the Declaration of Rights section, and this is where Jefferson states the beliefs that colonists have about their God-given rights and that the purpose of government is to protect those rights. The third part is a long list of grievances or complaints against the king and parliament. And this is where they list all the ways that they believe that England's government has violated their natural rights. And then that last part finishes the argument of the paper. Since England has violated our rights in all of these ways over a long period of time, we are now an independent and free nation. At the beginning of the war, if you would have just looked at the numbers, you would have said, my goodness, there is no way that the colonists can win this war. Britain had a much larger, a better trained, better supplied army. They had a navy, one of the most powerful navies in the world. The colonists had a small army and no navy. So on paper, this is a blowout. We know, of course, things turned out very differently. Britain actually expected a very short war. They thought they'd be able to get it over very quickly and return to normalcy. The Americans knew they needed to avoid just that. They couldn't allow the war to be short. They knew there's no way they could win a short war. So Washington was put in charge of the Continental Army. His strategy at the beginning was don't lose too bad. Don't get into that catastrophic battle with the British Army where I lose a large portion of my army and our chances of winning at the beginning are completely blown away. So we don't lose too bad. So he just basically, it's attack and retreat, don't lose too bad. His goal, of course, is to make the war last as long as possible, hoping that in the end, the cost of the war would be enough for England to say, listen, we give up, we quit, go ahead, go your own way, and be done with it. So that's his goal, make it as long and as costly as possible. And in addition to that, the Americans know they need foreign help, and they believe that other European countries may be willing to help them, not because they want the Americans to win their independence, but because they want to see England weakened. During the first part of the war, it goes pretty much as expected, and Washington and the Continental Army, they lose pretty much every battle. Morale is low. Many of the American soldiers want to quit. Washington has his friend Thomas Paine write another pamphlet, this one he entitles The Crisis. And in it, basically, Thomas Paine argues that, hey, things are bad, but this is the time when real men stick with it. And if you stick with it now, in the end, when we win, you will deserve the thanks of every man and woman. So this is an inspirational piece. The intended purpose was to inspire the American troops to stick with it through difficult times. Washington knows, though, that words will only go so far, and he needs a win and needs one desperately. So he comes up with a very daring plan. On Christmas Day of 1776, Washington takes 2,400 men across the icy Delaware River in small boats, and they achieve complete and total surprise attack on the town of Trenton, New Jersey in the early morning hours of December 26th. This is an American victory. Now, it's not a huge win. There are no British troops in Trenton. These are actually German mercenaries known as Hessians. Again, the Americans were able to achieve complete surprise, and they were able to capture over 1,400 troops and 39 officers. So this is the win Washington needed, again, to raise the morale of the American soldiers. This victory, though, was followed by more losses. For the next 9 or 10 months, the American army experiences loss after loss after loss. That changes with the Battle of Saratoga. Saratoga is in New York. The British were in the midst of trying to accomplish their plan of splitting the colonies in half. They wanted to separate the New England colonies from the rest of the colonies, and they were trying to do just that. When the Americans learned of this plan, the two armies meet at Saratoga. There are two battles fought in Saratoga, one in September and one in October of 1777. The Americans are able to win. Now, this is a really big one. This is the first major battle that the Americans are able to win against the British Army. And it has a number of important effects. First of all, it destroys British hopes that the war would be short. They know now they're in for a long war. Second thing is it lifts the spirits of the Americans. Hey, we can fight against these guys and we can win. So now they believe, again, that they have a chance. And the most important effect that came out of Saratoga was that it helped convince European countries that the Americans had a chance. European countries had been very reluctant to help. And with this victory, they agree to begin to help. So what happens? Hey, France and Spain and the Netherlands, they all want to see England weakened. And so they declare war on England in Europe. So now England is forced to fight a war on two fronts, which means they have fewer troops to spare to fight in America. Specific men from Europe who believe in the American cause for independence come over and help as well. And I've listed a few of them there. Baron von Steuben is very important at Valley Forge. Following the Battle of Saratoga, the American army goes into their winter quarters for the winter of 1777 and 78. The British, by the way, are able to spend their winter in Philadelphia in nice warm houses, and they are fully supplied. The Americans face very different circumstances. There's about 11,000, and they are not sufficiently fed, clothed. They had to build shelters that were just not capable of keeping them warm during a very cold winter. Many of them lack the most basic supplies, including shoes, socks, and even pants. And we see sickness go through the camp. We talked about smallpox. About 2,000 of the American soldiers die, and another 2,000 leave. They just go home. However, through this adversity, the army comes together. General Baron von Steuben, one of those Europeans who came over to help the Americans, is put in charge of training the army, and he does so very effectively. And so while they faced an incredibly difficult time at Valley Forge, the Americans leave much better prepared to face the British on the battlefield. Now, in the years following, For about the next 3 years, the Americans don't see a ton of success. However, they begin to hold their own against the British Army. There were a number of other groups of people that were impacted by the war. There were African Americans living in the colonies at the time, many of which were slaves. Most of these African Americans sided with the British because the British promised them freedom once the war was over. At first, Washington had a policy that African Americans were not allowed to fight in the war. He eventually changed that, though, and 5,000 did fight for the American side. Women took on added responsibility when the men were away at war. Many of them supported the war effort with clothing and supplies, and a few even disguised themselves as men and fought. As far as Native Americans were concerned, most helped the British, hoping that if the British won, the American colonists would be prevented from continuing to move westward and taking more Native American land. The war had a very devastating effect on the economy within the colonies. Much of their trade was with England, and during a war, of course, trade stops. And so they experienced an economic depression. Colonial money, which they created basically at this time, was called Continentals. It was pretty much worthless. The Continentals weren't even worth the paper that they were printed on. The most devastating effect, though, was inflation. And this is where prices go up. And inflation was very high during the war. There just was not enough supply to meet the demand for certain goods. So some of the most basic supplies that people needed, even to feed their families, were way too expensive for people to afford. Corn went up 10,000%. You can see beef went up 33,000%. We're going to fast forward now to the end of the war. So I told you over the next 3 years after Valley Forge, the Americans hold their own, but again, they're not able to gain a clear advantage. At this time, Britain uses a new strategy, and they begin to attack the Americans from the south. And their idea is, well, we'll just conquer these colonies one by one from the south, making our way north. And they begin in Georgia. They have great success there, but they run into problems in the Carolinas. And their forces are weakened through a series of battles there. The leader of the British Army, named General Cornwallis, then decides, well, we got to go and we need reinforcements. So he marches his army to Virginia, and he leads them onto Yorktown Peninsula. And I bolded peninsula because that's important to understand here. A peninsula is a piece of land surrounded on three sides by water. And what Cornwallis expected to find there was the British Navy, and they were going to provide his army with reinforcements and supplies. But what he finds, though, is that the French Navy has shown up. They have chased off British ships, blocking any escape by sea. Washington, along with some French forces, block British escape by land. They then have the British Army surrounded in Yorktown. A siege lasts for a couple of weeks, and eventually the British surrender. This is the last major battle of the war. The treaty that ends the war was signed in 1783. It's called the Treaty of Paris. The king wanted to keep fighting, but Britain said, no, it's time for peace. And because they were eager for peace, Americans got pretty much all they wanted in this treaty. And it was signed on April 15th of 1783. The treaty had 6 major parts. Okay, the first 3 were honored by both sides. The last 3 were not honored by either side. So the United States was recognized as a free and independent nation, and the borders for the United States were set as well. And you can see the United States in 1783 is this green portion right here. The western boundary was set at the Mississippi River. In addition to that, guys, the Americans were guaranteed fishing rights off of the East Coast. Now, the last 3 parts of the treaty were not honored by either side. Neither side repaid their war debt. Neither side returned any captured slaves to their owners. And the Americans did not return Loyalist property that had been confiscated during the war. Now, again, at the beginning, we said on paper, this is a war that the colonists should not have been able to win. But they did have some important advantages that in the end helped them to win this war. Number one, they were fighting for their home turf. Home field advantage was important. Number 2, they were fighting for a cause greater than themselves, patriotic spirit. Okay, they had good leadership with Washington. And then the most important factor in winning this war, guys, was help from European countries such as France, Spain, and the Netherlands.